Really? Okay. I wonder if I did that.
Our lesson, we're gonna do a deep dive or focus on physical development in infancy. So I'm gonna put slides and we will go from there. Now, as you may recall from our initial lecture, that there are different domains of development. The three major domains are physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional development. And the purpose of this lesson is to talk about physical development. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about motor skills, we're going to talk about senses and the experiences, all of this through the prism of infancy or the time frame of infancy. Now, when we talk about patterns of growth, there are two major patterns of growth in infancy. We have something called a cephalocaudal trend, and we have something called a proximodistal trend. A cephalocaudal trend means that development starts from head to toe, starts from the head down. Now, a way to remember this is think encephalon, think brain, right? So we're going to go from brain to body or top down. And this occurs in motor development as well. So things like lifting your head, turning your head, you're going to develop those skills before you're able to move other parts of your body. We also have something called a proximodistal trend. So, and you have a reference point, which is the midline of the body. You're going to develop control over the center of the body, and then it's going to go from the center outward, from close proximity to a greater distance from the trunk of the body. So your core outward. So this might explain why we do commando crawling before we can actually do full crawling with hands and legs. So we scooch on our bellies.
Neurologists are stunned. They've confirmed that ear ringing is shrinking your brain cells. Tinnitus is now known as precursor dementia, according to the Mayo Clinic, where doctors have made a shocking discovery that changes everything we know about ear buzzing and how it relates to mental decline. So if you or a loved one are plagued with the invisible agony of ear ringing, buzzing, or chirping sounds, then you must see this. After 2,400 brain scans and 4 decades of clinical research, an award-winning ENT scientist has just revealed the true root cause of tinnitus, and it has nothing to do with damage from trauma, lifestyle, aging, or genes, but instead with faulty nerve hair linking between your ear and brain. Over time, this newly discovered nerve hair becomes frayed, and when broken, it mixes up your brain's interpretation of signals, causing the cringing, ringing, hissing, washing, and buzzing. This in turn causes brain cells to shrink, wiping out your memory by the minute. This world-renowned scientist was forced out of his practice after he revealed a billion-dollar secret he wasn't supposed to know. A clinically proven 10-second technique that could finally switch off those cringing sounds so you can feel completely normal once more. More than 85,670 people are already doing it. And not only have they been able to reverse their tinnitus, but they are also increasing their protection against brain disease and aneurysms while enjoying clear minds and sharp focus. Mark from New Jersey said, "I thought I was doomed, but now I'm back to my normal life. After 10 years, I have found peace again, and my headaches and vertigo have also gone." Relief is possible no matter how old you are, your current condition, or how severe your tinnitus has gotten. Tap the blue Watch Now button below for a free video. You'll see how this unconventional method takes only seconds a day and gets to work to mute the constant ringing and buzzing almost instantly. It calms the nerves and reduces inflammation, which helps send the proper signals back to the brain. And when this is corrected, the agonizing sounds are silenced for good, all without the need for medications and their side effects or expensive therapies. So stop what you're doing right now and click the blue Watch Now button to see a short eye-opening video. You'll see how thousands of people are using this strange 10-second technique to silence the buzzing, clicking, ringing, and pain. And best of all, live life like normal again. However, the billion-dollar healthcare industry has already removed this special presentation from the internet twice before in a desperate attempt to protect their profits. So it's uncertain how long the information will remain available this time. Tap the blue Watch Now button below before it's too late.
Melt fat like butter with this new powerful military invention. This new $69 Special Forces device emulates 54,000 crunches in 20 minutes, allowing you to melt away tens of pounds of stubborn fat in just a few weeks without restrictive diets. And it's 10 times faster than regular exercise. It was created by Captain James Snipes, a 31-year-old Special Forces officer and a bioengineer. After being wounded in his last mission and spending 3 months in a hospital, he felt weak and realized he wouldn't have enough time to get back in shape for the critical next mission. That's when he remembered what he learned in the army about using electronic muscle stimulation and had a desperate idea. Using the EIND phenomenon that powers all the muscle tissue growth in a human's body, he built a revolutionary device that uses military technology and an innovative type of stimulation to ignite rapid fat loss and explosive muscle gain. Having only 3 weeks left for the mission, he started using the device for 20 minutes per day to improve his core, arms and legs muscles, and the results were incredible. Just after a few days, he began feeling stronger and started losing fat he gained when recovering in the hospital. And after only 2 weeks of using the device, he was back in peak physical condition and his muscles were visible like never before. That's when James realized how powerful his invention was and decided to start producing it for the general public to bring this life-changing technology to anyone in need. He called it Tactical X-Ab Stimulator and is the most powerful tool for bodybuilding ever made that allows anyone to burn fat and get a six-pack abs within just a few weeks. It works by sending gentle electric to exercise the affected muscle and promote rapid muscle growth while burning belly fat at the same time. When your muscles receive the signal, they contract and flex, replicating natural muscle contractions and emulating over 50,000 crunches in just a single 15-minute session. The electric pulses not only target and stimulate the deepest core muscles, but also you can use it for your arms and legs, emulating a full body workout. Whether you want to lose weight or build six-pack abs that will draw everyone's attention on the beach, the possibilities with the Tactical X-Ab Stimulator are endless. James wants everyone to know about this new technology, so he's offering a 60% discount for anyone who orders it within the next 24 hours. So go ahead and grab one for yourself and more for your friends and family before this amazing deal is taken down. Click on the link on this video to visit the official website and order with 60% off and free express worldwide shipping.
Now, another thing that we want to see is that there is a disproportionate shape. Now, if we look at the proportion of head to body, this is emphasizing the cephalocaudal trend. At 5 months of prenatal development, the head is about 1/3 of the full length of the body. And by newborn, so if you're full length, it becomes 1/4. And by the time you hit puberty, it's going to be 1/7 of your body. But if you could see, we develop from head to toe. That's important to understand. Now, the two trends in infancy are cephalocaudal and proximodistal. But there's another trend in adolescence or puberty, which is disto-proximal, outward in, and we'll talk about that in another lesson. But I wanted to plant a seed for later. All right. Now, when we talk about the brain, we have to talk about the different parts of the brain. The forebrain is the farthest most part of the brain from the spinal cord. That it includes your cerebral cortex and other structures. Now, The cerebral cortex can be divided into two hemispheres, your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere. We have a dominant hemisphere and a non-dominant hemisphere. The dominant hemisphere is contralateral to your writing hand. Fancy way of saying your dominant hemisphere is on the opposite side of your writing hand. So most people are right-handed, so their dominant hemisphere would be the left hemisphere. But those of us, myself included, who are left-handed, we are the only ones in our right mind. That's a bad joke. But we are right brain because we're left-handed, or in about half of left-handed individuals, we have codominance across hemispheres. Now that may seem like big deal. Lefties get a little bit of an advantage of codominance, some of them. But I want you to think about strokes. And if you have codominance across hemispheres, the functional deficits that you might experience later in life are going to be less severe than if you're right-handed, let's say, and have a stroke on one side. So we could divide into hemispheres, and there is a big groove down the middle of the brain, which divides the two sides. But on a particular side, you could do frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobe. And each of these parts of the brain, each of these lobes do something different. The frontal lobe has the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for judgment, decision-making, executive functioning, things like that. It also has Broca's area, which is responsible for speech production. And it also has the motor cortex, which sends messages down from the brain to the body so I can move my hands. Moving backwards, and I'm going to go out of order. I'm going to go to the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe has the somatosensory cortex, which is responsible for the sense of touch. It also has a major section, the central region, or the medial parietal lobule, is responsible for spatial awareness or spatial location. So that's your parietal lobe. In the back of your brain, you have your occipital lobe, and the occipital lobe plays a vital function in vision, and your temporal lobe plays a role in speech and language comprehension, hearing, and a whole host of emotions and memory. Now, we talk about lateralization in the brain. And lateralization of the brain suggests that different sides or hemispheres of the brain do different things from other hemispheres. So when we talk about spatial awareness versus writing ability, positive emotions versus negative emotions, and I say versus because they're on opposite sides of the brain. Now, many things are lateralized, but some are not. Many systems in the brain require complex communication between the hemispheres and alongside different structures. And you'll see, for example, with vision is an intricate system where you have a 50% decussation, which is a fancy way of saying 50% of the fibers that go out of the eye go to the other side of the brain, and the other 50 stay on the same side. So that's important to understand. Now, neurons, when we talk about the brain, we can look at structures as a large scale, or we can look at the brain on the small scale. And a neuron is just a brain cell. And a cell is the smallest unit of life. And similar to all other cells, the neuron is going to have different parts. It's going to have a soma, which is the cell body. And the cell body has the nucleus, the nucleolus, the DNA, all of that jazz is in the cell body. And that's sort of like the executive center of the cell. But you also have ways of receiving messages and sending messages. And again, I'm going to go out of order because I like to talk about receiving messages first. You have something called dendrites, and your dendrites or dendritic spines have receptors where you can receive a message from another neuron. Your soma, it goes from the dendrite to the soma, processes it. If the soma determines this message is important, now how does it determine it's important? Based on action potentials, that's for another point. But if it's important, it's going to send a message out. And the output from a neuron to another neuron goes out from an axon. The axon is an elongated structure, many times covered by myelin sheath, which is a wrapped up protective covering around the neuron. And the myelin sheath, or the fatty substance that wraps around it, serves three functions. It serves to speed up an impulse. Myelinated neurons go faster than unmyelinated neurons. It serves a protective functioning. Again, within a neuron, we're dealing with action potentials, so we're dealing with electricity inside the cell, and we want to get the voltage to negative 55 millivolts for an action potential. But I'm sure many of you have had your car die, and then you put your cables on another car, and then you put the other two sides together and it sparks. Well, that's because there's current running through the jumper cables. Same thing can be said about your neurons. There's current running through each of the neurons. And if you didn't have a myelin sheath covering them, you have two live wires that could spark like your jumper cables and short circuit one another. So one major function of the myelin sheath is to protect it from short circuiting, and the myelin also helps with regeneration. So you have three functions of myelin sheath: speed up impulse, protect the neuron, and help regenerate. Now, at the end of the axon is a bulb-like structure called the terminal button. And inside the terminal button are sacs or vesicles that have chemicals called neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters are chemical messengers in the brain. And they are responsible, that is the message itself, that binds to another receptor on another cell, which tells it to either increase its polarity or decrease its polarity. In fancy ways, say telling it to either fire or not. So, and between the neurons, we have synapses, which are gaps, right? Now, we like to talk about the nervous system being an electrochemical system. And write this down. Within a specific neuron, it's electrical. Between neurons, it's more chemical. So we call it an electrochemical system because there's something that happens both within and across neurons. All right. So that's important. Now, there's one more thing that I like to give people a way of thinking about these different parts of the neuron. And I like to describe the neuron similar to an email server. Now, I don't care if you have Gmail, I don't care if you have Yahoo, I don't care if you're like me who has AOL. you are going to have the server itself, which I give the analogy, the server is similar to the soma or the cell body. You're also going to have an inbox. An inbox is where you receive messages, so your inbox is analogous to your dendrites. You're also going to have an outbox. An outbox is where you send messages. So that's where your axons are. Now, you have another box called your spam folder or deleted mail. And believe it or not, the nervous system has that process too. So when you release these neurotransmitters into the gap, we have a function where if the neurotransmitter is not being used, there are enzymes that break down the neurotransmitter in the gap. And I would say that's a way of protecting you against spamming, having too much of a given neuron in the gap. Another thing you have is something called reuptake, or endocytosis is when you recall neurotransmitters or bring it back into the original neuron. So if it's not being used, this might be your way of deleting the message. So bringing it back in and recycling. So it's interesting, you could talk about nerves or neurons and equate it to a computer. But I hope that helps with some kind of understanding. Now, I talked to you about the myelination. Actually, before I go there, what you're looking at here is a classic motor cell. And each neuron has its own morphology, its own shape, and each neuron has its own function. And oftentimes the shape and function are related. Now, what you're looking at here is a picture of a motor neuron, and most textbooks use a motor neuron because it's the most spread out type of neuron. So you have the branches or the dendrites, you have the cell body or soma, you have the axons, you have the myelin sheath. Now it's interesting, if I were to have drawn this neuron, I would have made little gaps between the myelin, because the myelin sheath is not continuous. You have something called nodes of RANVA, which are little spaces between myelin where you can allow sodium to come in, and that continues to propagate the impulse down the axon. So that's part of the process that actually helps speed up a neuron. And then at the end, you see these little bulbs. Those are the terminal buttons, and that's where your neurotransmitters are. And that's where your vesicles are. So that's the morphology of a motor neuron. That's what it looks like. That's the various parts. Now, I said to you, inside the neuron, you're dealing with electrical properties. So each neurotransmitter is going to either excite a neuron, depolarizing that cell, making it more likely to fire, or that neuron is going to inhibit an action potential, making it hyperpolarized. So that's what all of the neurotransmitters do. Now, it's important to understand, so the voltage within a cell is going to fluctuate from baseline, or what we call resting potential. I talked to you about when an action potential is, but I didn't really talk to you about resting potential. Resting potential is negative 70 millivolts. And the threshold for an action potential is negative 55 millivolts. So you have to depolarize it roughly 15 millivolts for an action potential. Now, but the other thing I said, so it's clear that inside the neuron it's electrical, and similar to other electrical engineers, you stick in a voltmeter on the inside and outside of the cell and compare the difference, and you would get this polarity. So inside the cell, electrical. Between the cells is chemical. Remember what I said? I said between the neurons is a synapse. That's a gap between the two cells. So you might have asked yourself, well, why not just have a continuous wire? That makes a lot of sense. But imagine you were charging your computer and I cut the charging cable and created a gap. Would your computer continue to charge? The answer is no, because I've severed the connection between the power source and your laptop. So the same thing could be said about synapses. It's as if we had cut wires. So we have to have an alternative method to keep the message going, keep the impulse traveling between neurons. So that's where neurotransmitters or these chemical messengers come in, and that's why they're released into the gap, bind onto receptor sites, and change the polarity of the next neuron. It's a really cool system. Now, I talked about myelination. On that picture, you saw that those were like bubbles on it, fatty substance. Now, it protects the neuron. It increases impulses, the speed of impulse. It helps regeneration. But myelin starts to occur during prenatal development and continues all the way into adolescence. We also tend to see greater development of neurons. So we have something called neurogenesis, which is a fancy way of saying the rapid creation of new neurons. We also have connections between neurons happening, which we call synapsogenesis. Now, we create an over-exuberance amount of neurons and synaptic connections. But that's because your brain doesn't know which ones are going to take hold. So it's sort of use it or lose it. We do go into a process of programmed cell death or apoptosis, where the cells that aren't used die out, the neurons that aren't used die out. And we do engage in something called synaptic pruning, which are the connections, bridges between neurons that aren't used get pruned out. Now here is a picture of the interactions between neurons between birth and 2 years old. So we're looking at infancy, and look at how it starts really spread out, but by 2 years it's all kind of intertwined and the neurons are really interconnected. That is an example of both neurogenesis, the proliferation of neurons, and synapsogenesis, the beautiful bridging of multiple connections. Now, we also see changes in various parts of the brain. I said to you already that there's a blooming and pruning process for synapses, but when these blooming and pruning occur are at different speeds. So if you look at your graph to the right, the visual cortex is the first or second roughly to bloom, but then it prunes fairly quickly, whereas the auditory cortex and the prefrontal cortex continue to move forward. So it's fairly fascinating the speed by which the neurons are created and pruned out is at different speeds or paces. We also see the pace of myelination, or the covering of the neuron, occurs at different speeds. All right. Now, we have seen some incredible research about enriched environment versus deprived environments. Now, we see research that suggests that more enriched environments is going to increase brain development, brain activity, and have these synaptic connections occur quicker. Whereas deprivation is going to result in delays in development in the brain. Now, what I will tell you in Western society, even the most poor of individuals has an enriched environment. But there are studies where kids were dropped off at orphanages and just left in a crib with no enrichment. And we see that their motor development is delayed, that part of the brain. We see their speech development is delayed. We see delays in IQ because of the lack of enrichments. So, at its extreme, being raised in a deprived environment is going to negatively affect brain development. Now, at birth, we start to see development of the senses. Some senses are fairly hardwired at birth. Other senses need to refine themselves through infancy. For example, taste, touch, these are senses, taste, touch, and smell. Let's put them together, which are fairly fully developed at birth, fully functional. Whereas vision and hearing refine themselves through infancy, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, the brain is flexible and resilient, so that's nice. It's important to understand that the brain can adapt. And the earlier you are in development, if a trauma occurs, the more likely your brain is going to adapt and rewire itself in a way that you have minimal functional deficits. Now, I want to introduce you to what's called a dynamic systems model. Now, I said to you in our first lecture that there are 3 domains of development: physical development, cognitive development, and socio-emotional development. And what the dynamic systems model suggests is that they're not happening independent of one another. They're actually happening at the same time, and they can affect one another. So physical development impacts cognitive development and social development, and vice versa. So you see how each one branches onto the other. So let's talk about motor skills. Motor skills could be gross motor skills, where you're moving your whole body or your large muscle groups through space, or fine motor skills, which are smaller parts of the body or discrete body limbs. That would be fine motor control. But each of these require communication across physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional domains. Let me explain. In order for motor development to occur, you need development of the nervous system. Well, that's biological, so that's going to be physical. You need the body's physical properties and capabilities for movement. That's also going to be physical. You need the kid to want to reach for something. That's motivation. Well, that's cognitive. And then environmental support, familial support, parental support, caregiver support. So these 4 bullet points, the first 2 are physical, the third one is cognitive, and the last one is socio-emotional. All of these play a role in something as simple as motor development. Now, if we look at gross motor development, this is a nice depiction of some of the skills you acquire in gross motor skills. So at first, you're going to be able to lift your head. And that's important, right? Because I said this cephalocaudal trend is at play. And then you're going to be able to prop yourself up with your hands. You're going to be able to roll over, and eventually you're going to start to crawl and sit, and then eventually you're going to walk and run. Now, what's interesting is that these blue graphs suggest that there's a range of time when these motor skills are supposed to occur. But on average, people are walking roughly about 12 to 13 months. that's when they take their first step. But notice how it starts with just being able to lift the head.
Hey there, want the secret to stop competing for that measly little raise that you can't even notice in your paycheck?
All right. Now, we tend to see further development in the second year. Toddlers become more skilled. They go from walking stiffly like Frankenstein to being able to squat, being able to walk backwards, being able to jump, being able to run. All of these gross motor skills that are happening. But now notice I keep using the word gross motor skills. Why is it that I'm using the term gross motor skills? As I said earlier, they're using their whole body to move or to do this motor movement. Now there are cultural variations in motor development. So if we were to compare the United States, the tribal nations in Mexico, and Jamaica, 3 countries, and we were to see how these nations either support, inhibit, or relatively neutral motor development, we see that the rate or the speed by which you acquire the motor milestone has changed. For example, indigenous Indians in Mexico inhibit motor development. They discourage learning how to walk because there is a fear that if they start to move about too early, they're going to hurt, they might burn themselves on fire. So they actively dissuade motor development. Whereas in the United States, we don't force motor development, but we don't inhibit it, so we're benign about it, or agnostic about it. And in Jamaica and in Kenya, they actually encourage motor development by holding the kids' hands and putting the feet over the feet and teaching them how to walk. And sure enough, we find that Jamaican and Kenyan kids tend to develop the ability to walk earlier than American and Mexican counterparts. And then Mexican counterparts, they tend to walk last. So there are cultural variations, but we still have general guidelines for each. So we talk about gross motor development. Now let's talk about fine motor development. When we talk about fine motor development, we're talking about basic movement of discrete parts of the body. And the most common fine motor skill that we're going to talk about is reaching and grasping. So reaching and grasping in infancy are huge, right? So what you might see if you put a kid on their back, an infant on their back, and you have a mobile, that they might start with something called pre-reaching, where they're swinging in an uncoordinated fashion. But that pre-reaching, eventually they're better at grabbing, but they engage in the palmar grasp. The palmar grasp is where they grab things with their whole hand. So if you ever see a kid that's maybe 6 months old in a high chair eating Cheerios, they might grab it with, or dissolvable cereal, they grab it with their whole hand. But by about a year, they engage in the pincer grip, which is what we use to use 2 fingers to pick something up discreetly. Now, what's interesting is there is something that happens in between the stages of the palmar grasp, the whole hand, and the pincer grasp, is that they learn to coordinate switching hands. So there is a connection between perceptual motor coupling, which helps them coordinate this reaching and grasping sense. All right, now we tend to see experienced infants tend to look at objects longer, reach for them more, and they're likely to put things in their mouth. And I'm going to talk about that as part of, it's a risk and a benefit, right? They explore an object, but it also is a choking hazard. Now, we also have studies to determine preference, and this is what we call a visual preference method where we measure looking time. And in a case of looking time, we have kids look at things and we time how long they look at it. And the inference is that the preferred object is the object that they look at longer. Now, the preferred object can occur in one of two ways. You could prefer the object because it's familiar to you, or you could prefer an object because it's novel or unique. So there are studies that demonstrate preference based on looking that are based on novelty preference, and others that are based on familiarity preference. But if you show something over and over and over, eventually you're going to see looking time decreases. So they're going to habituate or get used to that stimulus. So they're going to respond to that stimulus at a lower rate. So habituation refers to decreased responsiveness to a stimulus. Whereas dishabituation is where you start to respond at a greater rate to a response that you previously inhibited. So an example I give, and it's not for infancy, but let's say you moved from a small town and you moved to Brooklyn, New York. There are a lot of trains going overhead, underground. It's very noisy. So it will take you a very long time to habituate to the sound of the train. But eventually, your first night, you're not going to be able to sleep so easily, but maybe by a month, you're in the background. You become habituated. Now, let's say at the end of a semester, end of a year, you go back home for the winter break or for the summer break, and then you come back the following fall. Now, you were used to the subway running, but then you went back. And now you come back, you might struggle sleeping again. Because even though you were habituated to the sound of the subway, something happened in between which brought more attention to the subway again. So it's a recovery of a previously habituated response. Now, so we talked about habituation. So if we're showing a slanted black and white pattern in a series of trials, eventually the child is going to, the infant is going to stop looking at it, or the amount of time that they look at the stimulus is going to drop. That's habituation. Now, when you have that familiar stimulus with a new stimulus, which is a novelty preference, you're going to look longer at the new stimulus because it was less familiar. Now, typically, there's a general rule about when the novelty preference is stronger and when the familiarity preference is stronger. The novelty preference is stronger when you're doing an immediate test, so whatever you primed was in the short-term memory. Whereas the familiarity preference is stronger for long-term memory or delayed looking tasks. So I think it's important to understand some of the research on habituation, dishabituation, the familiarity preference and the novelty preference and how they work.
What is the real story of January 6th? Many people have asked that question. Some people have...
All right. Now, we see that habituation and dishabituation studies have been used for looking, tracking, heart rate, respiratory function. We can see habituation and changes in all of these actions using various kinds of studies. Now let's talk about some of the senses. I said to you that some of the senses are pretty hardwired. So taste, smell, and touch are fairly hardwired. and other senses need to develop through time. So one of those senses that needs to develop through time is the sense of vision. And at birth, your vision is fairly blurry. So you would be considered 2600 at birth. What does that mean? That, I'll say it two ways. An object that is 20 feet away looks as if it's 600 feet away, or you would need to be 20 feet away from something that someone else could see at 600 feet away. So your vision is not fully developed. By 6 months old, your vision is much better. It's 2100, and eventually it gets to be 2020, which is perfect vision. And yeah, so about 1 year old, you have your perfect vision. We also tend to see preferences in vision. Human faces are preferred after birth over non-human faces. How many of you have seen Mr. Potato Head, where you get the holes and you can put the face on? Well, believe it or not, with preference tests, kids prefer normal or organized faces, the eyes above the nose, above the mouth, versus it inverted or sideways. And kids are wired to prefer more attractive looking faces versus more homely faces. Now here is a visual acuity picture. So if you look at the far left, that's what a person would look like with very little detail. And that's because your cones have not fully developed yet. You look very blurry at birth. But by 1 year old, you see how crystal clear this person became. Same person, but they become clearer and clearer through time. Now, in terms of visual perception, we talk about the processes of scanning a face. To understand a face, you can see what a kid looks at is very simple, very gross shape. It starts and it goes across the eyes, it goes across the top, gets a shape. But you'll notice by 2 months old, forgive me, it's even more intricate and it gets more intricate from there. Now, in addition to visual acuity, there's something called depth perception. And depth perception, there was a great study done by Eleanor Gibson and Richard Walk, which they created something called the visual clef. And what that was is that they had a parent on one side of the room, the infant and the experimenter on the other side of the room, and a plexiglass bridge that they could walk above. And under the bridge was sort of like a checkered board that it gave the illusion that if they crossed this cliff, they would fall. What we found was that by 6 months to 12 months, kids develop depth perception in a way that they won't cross the bridge. They might sit there and cry. Now, one of the things that helps with depth perception and three-dimensional perception is crawling. And we tend to see that you start to crawl at about 6 months. So that might explain part of why kids understand the visual clef, and the parent could call them, and they don't really fall. There's a plexiglass bridge across that they could walk and be safe, but the kid knows that they should be falling because it's clear down. Now, what we see is that the starting of depth perception happens as early as 2 to 4 months, though, because we can demonstrate this through physiological response. So the heart rate changes, right, when they're put on the deep side of the clef. We also start to see binocular depth cues using minor disparities between the two eyes to give you ideas about depth. This is a picture of the plexiglass chamber. Again, the kids on one side, you see the plexiglass that they could cross, and the parents on the other side and are calling them. And this picture is cut off, but what you likely would see is the kid just sitting there crying and wanting to go to their caregiver, but not crossing. Now, the goal of the study is to demonstrate depth perception. So this is a good study because it does that. Now, in terms of sound, fetuses can learn sound during the last 2 months of pregnancy, and they can recognize their own mother's voice or their own caregiver's voice. And what we see is that pitch, octaves, breaking down parts of sound and words, infants and newborns can't do that very well. Now, touch and pain, smell, and taste are fairly hardwired. Now, we talk about proprioception and nociception. Nociception is pain. You can tell an infant's in pain because the kind of cry they demonstrate is high-pitched and shrill versus their standard cry. Smell, you can demonstrate preference for smell. One interesting study, or I'll tell you 2 interesting studies. One interesting study about smell is that children naturally prefer sweet and pleasant smelling things like bananas and chocolate, whereas they don't like sulfuric or egg-like smells naturally. But you could also teach a preference for smell. In utero, there was an anise study where some kids were exposed, and this is smell and taste, but anise is like a licoricey smell. It's a spice, where some kids, their mom ingested anise for the last few weeks of pregnancy, and other moms didn't. That was a control group. And then they put this anise smelling thing where under the nose of the different kids. And the kids that were exposed prenatally to anise didn't react, whereas the kids that weren't exposed to it, they turned away, they cried because they didn't like the smell. So we're wired for certain smells, but we can also condition certain smells, as well as same thing with taste. We can acquire a taste for things as well. Again, sweet tasting things are more desirable over things like sour or bitter tasting things. Now, kids can discern that at birth, but nevertheless, the taste that is more preferred is sweet. Now, I did say you can acquire a taste. Examples of acquired taste, not necessarily in infancy, but to demonstrate that this occurs is beer. If you ask people, did they originally like the taste of beer? Many people will say no. And then you might ask, well, why did you continue drinking beer then? Well, I acquired a taste. Now, why did you acquire a taste? Because they got buzzed. They got high off of it, so they continued to drink it. So that's the other senses. Now, we talk about intermodal perception. So inter means between, modal means modality, perception. So an intermodal perception is the ability to integrate 2 or more sensory modalities. So an example of integrating multiple modalities is language development requires intermodal perception. There is something called amodal perception. That's not on the slide. That's when you're not relying on any sense organ, but you learn things. And you're like, wait, but if you're not sensing something, how are you perceiving something? Well, we can perceive things between sensory stimulation. So things like rhythm and timing and speed of music, right? So if I'm doing drumming versus, right, you can determine timing based on the pause between the beats. That's a modal perception. Now, perceptual motor coupling links your perceptual skills to guide motor activities. And that, in a nutshell, is our very, very brief lecture on physical development in infancy. I'm going to stop there. Take care, everybody.
Michael's hottest summer deals are here. Shop now.
All right, so that's some of the development stuff. We did have one on how language develops, and that is getting back to.
Did you know that real estate has created 90% of the world's millionaires? Yes, a staggering.
All right, so we're going to continue.
And so let me see if this most recent one shows up. We had just finished with chapter 4 with infancy, and I wanted to make sure we got through everything with the gross motor, when they stand up, the different sleep and active states with the newborns, infant mental health, and then early interventions for developmental delay, the sudden infant death syndrome and why it's higher in some communities, and then how language and cognitive development, they follow the phase and they assess how the child is learning, crying at birth, cooing at 2 months, laughing at 4 months, babbling and gestures for up at 6 months, 9 months, mama and dada, and then waves bye-bye at 10, and the first words are at 12. And can also shake their head no at 15 months, use 3 to 5 words, and then 18 to 24 months, they have a vocab of like 50 words. So, Dr. Kaplan was talking about at 1 month, they discriminate about the mother's voice. They have reciprocal smiling. They stop crying at parents' voice at 4 months, and spontaneous smiles. They have stranger anxiety at 6 months. So I'm going to get to this one next.
With our lifespan development series, and in this particular lesson, we're going to talk about cognitive development and socio-emotional development in infancy. The lecture is a little bit longer than some of the other ones that I have within a time period. So let me start the slideshow, and we're going to do a full screen slideshow from the current slide. All right, so let's start with cognitive development. Now, you may recall from a previous lesson that cognition refers to how we think or make meaning of the world.
I know.
So, according to Piaget, he proposed that we build mental structures that help us adapt to the world around us. And adaptation involves adjusting to the new environmental needs. Now, we'll talk about assimilation and accommodation and things of that nature, which are processes of adaptation as we progress, but let's frame it here. Now, another thing that Piaget stresses is that children actively construct their own cognitive worlds through interaction with their environment.
Who cares?
So he operates using a constructivist point of view. And then he also believed in stage theory. So there are systematic changes in thinking that occur at different points in their development. So let's talk about schemes, or some books will refer to it as schemata or schema. A scheme is a mental representation.
I know.
It's a worldview, how you understand or organize your knowledge. Now, we have both behavioral and mental schemes. So a behavioral scheme might be related to physical activities. So your understanding of stacking blocks could be an example of a physical scheme. They could be simple actions that you perform on objects. A mental scheme, which is a cognitive activity, also develops in childhood. And here is where you develop strategies for problem solving. So, within schemas, how does our schema develop? How does our worldview adjust itself or organize? Well, there are two processes at play. And the first one is assimilation. So if new information comes in, you try and organize it around the existing information. So if that new information matches the existing information, we refer to that as assimilation. It's naturally blended in. Now, you may have heard the term assimilation in the context of culture. And when we talk about culture, when people migrate from one part of the world to another, one of the options is to assimilate or blend into the host nation's dress, values, etc. I'm not saying that's necessarily the ideal, but that is an option. So you probably have heard of assimilation that way. Accommodation, again, we're dealing with schema, our worldview. Our worldview can shift when new information changes or is inconsistent with the existing information. So if that new information does not match the existing information, we have to go through a reorganization process to build that schema out. So assimilation, naturally blending in a schema. Accommodation is adjusting an existing schema, taking new information into consideration. And then organization is the process of grouping isolated behavior and thoughts together into a higher order system. Now, as we move through development, we're sometimes gonna be in a state of cognitive conflict, and sometimes we're not. So we go through this process of equilibration, or which is a way of saying going from equilibrium where everything's at balance and we're not in conflict to disequilibrium when there's more conflict. And we go in and out of states of equilibrium. And that's okay. It's expected that kids are going to be in periods of disequilibrium. And that occurs when this new information is inconsistent with the existing information, forcing us to potentially change the way we think about something. All right. So according to Piaget, we go through 4 stages of development, and the 4 stages are sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational thought. Now, for the purpose of this lecture, we are only going to talk about sensory motor development, and that occurs between birth to 2 years old, according to Piaget. So, why is it called sensory motor stage? Because a child understands their world through sensory input and motor output. I mentioned in an earlier lecture that it's not uncommon for infants physically to put things in their mouth. So it could be a biological process such as food, or it could be a way of mouthing an object to know what it is. So in the sensory motor stage, putting blocks in one's mouth serves another purpose, which is to understand what blocks are. It's interesting if you look at it, an infant can play with a piece of fuzz for hours. And you might wonder, well, why can an infant play with a piece of fuzz for hours? They're exploring their world, trying to make sense of the world using their various senses.
Don't get another expensive facial before you watch this. Remember that skin hack that went viral where people were rubbing aloe vera sticks off?
All right. Now, within the sensory motor stage, there are 6 sub-stages. that go from simple reflexes to primary circular reactions, secondary circular reactions, coordination of secondary circular reactions, tertiary reactions, and internalization of schemes. Now, when we talk about this, I'm going to go through them because I think it's important. A reflex is an unlearned response. It does not need to be taught. You naturally do it. There are many types of reflexes. The rooting reflex. The rooting reflex in infancy is if you stroke a baby's cheek, they're going to turn their head towards you in an attempt to latch onto a nipple and feed. The sucking reflex, the grasping reflex. The grasping reflex builds attachment. We also have things like the Babinski reflex, where if you stroke the soles of the feet, the toes curl in and expand. And there are many more. Blinking reflex, breathing reflex. And we say that reflexes are unlearned responses because you don't need to be taught them. They naturally occur. They're involuntary responses to the environment. Now, what's interesting, though, is in infancy, reflexes can become more voluntary and we can gain more control over it. For example, I said to you the breathing reflex is reflexive, right? You don't need to be taught to breathe. You just naturally do it. But you can teach a regulation of the breath where you can intentionally control something that was involuntary. All right. Primary circular reactions, this is control over one's body. So the ability to coordinate movement of one's hand, interacting with various parts of the body, such as a baby moving one's hand to suck their thumb, would be a primary circular reaction. Now, circular reactions are repetitive behaviors. That's what they are. Primary is primary to the body, so it's the moving the body itself. Secondary circular reactions would start to occur at about 4 to 8 months, right? Secondary circular reactions, now we're using our body to manipulate something outside of itself, to manipulate something in the environment, whether it be to take a sippy cup and drop it on the floor. Now, anyone who has kids has probably seen this on replay over and over and over. You have an infant that's about 6, 7 months sitting in a high chair. You give them a sippy cup. What do? They drop it on the floor. So what do? You pick it up, you put it back on the high chair. What do? They drop it on the floor. What do? You pick it up. What do? They drop it on the floor. And this goes on and on and on until the parent gets frustrated and says, listen, you little shit. No, just kidding. Don't say that to your kids. But what is the kid doing? Piaget is arguing that the kid is exploring. They're like little scientists exploring their environment. And I'm going to argue what the child is doing is learning the rules of gravity. They learn that when you drop a sippy cup, it falls to the ground consistently. And they need to drop that sippy cup over and over and over to reproduce their miniature science experiment, right? So they have to do it over and over to understand how gravity works. And on a social level, they're learning the rules of attachment, and they're learning the rules of parenting. The more you pick that sippy cup up, the more that child learns they can depend on you. You are reliable. So that circular reaction, that repetitive act of dropping the sippy cup, is a science experiment for an infant. So as much as I joke, do not get frustrated with your kid. They're doing it to learn about the world around them. Now, there is a coordination phase. The coordination phase happens at about 8 to 12 months. Now they're starting to coordinate the various senses. such as vision and touch. They're developing better hand-eye coordination, and they're refining their ability to manipulate things in their world. Now, tertiary reactions are using novel outcomes with 2 or more secondary reactions. So they're becoming more intrigued about the properties of objects and trying to create novel reactions. So something like a dropping response, they might learn that if they have a different release point, they can launch the sippy cup. So instead of just dropping it down, now they're throwing it, right? That's actually a tertiary reaction, learning a new outcome. And then by stage 6, which is 18 to 24 months, there's an internalization of the schemes and there's greater mental representation. All right, so the biggest goal, according to Piaget, you go through a series of stages, 4 stages, right? And a stage theory assumes that there must be some conflict that needs to be resolved between each stage. So one of the tests that needs to be demonstrated for mental representation is something called object permanence. And according to Piaget, object permanence is the awareness that an object continues to exist even when you cannot see it. Now, in early stages, first 6 months or so, out of sight, out of mind. So if an infant is playing with something and you don't want them to, just hide it, and then they'll just go on to the next thing. And by about a year or so, now they're searching the common locations, but they don't really fully understand all the places it could be or fully understand object permanence. But by about 18 months, now they've mastered it. Now they've mastered object permanence. And they recognize that things don't just magically disappear. And that's why when you have a 2-year-old who wants cookies and you hide the cookie jar, they're going to take a chair from the kitchen and move it to the cabinets and climb up the chair onto the counters and search all of your cupboards till they find the cookie. Why is that? Because even at 18 months to 2 years old, that child knows that those cookies didn't just magically disappear, you just changed the location. Same thing with human beings. Now, I don't know if you've had the uncomfortable experience where you go out and then you come back. Let's say you went to the mall. You go to the mall and you come out of the mall and you go and you're like, well, where's my car? Do you say, whoa, my car just magically disappeared and it no longer exists? Poof, Harry Potter? No, you don't say that. You say, oh, geez, I don't know where I parked. Your first assumption is you can't remember where you parked. Let's say you did remember where you parked and your car is still not there. Do you now believe in Harry Potter and the magic? No, you don't. The next assumption, especially in New York, is maybe someone stole it. And that, forgive me for being a little cynical, right? And if they didn't steal it, maybe it got towed or whatever it is. But we understand that objects don't just magically disappear. They're somewhere. So if you ever lost your car or lost your keys, lost your remote, you're going to search high and low until you find it. Now, that's object permanence, awareness of the properties of an object. Object permanence is an understanding of mental representation, right? How objects exist in the world. Now, there are studies, and I'm going to talk about them, called violation of expectation studies, which demonstrate it's possible that children understand object permanence earlier than Piaget proposed. Because according to Piaget, it's about 18 months that you master object permanence, 2 years at its max. But in violation of expectation studies, it's demonstrated earlier. So here it looks like you hide an object, they find it, hide an object, they find it,
You hear Dr.
hide an object, move it to another location, and then it's not there. You want to see if they're going to search for it. But depending on their age, they're either going to stop looking right away, they're going to search in one location, which is the common location, or they're going to search high and low.
Showing up on the first page of Google might not be the best for everyone. But for business owners it is. Take My Vintage's online store. It ranks for thousands of competitive keywords like vintage clothing, which gets loads of searches on a monthly basis. And 80% of that traffic goes to their site. They also rank for over 1,000 images on Google. All of this drives tons of organic traffic every single month, leading to incredible organic growth year over year and a lot more sales. For those who want to be seen, Wix.com/SEO.
So, here's an example of demonstrating mental representation much earlier. And we're talking about just a few months old. Kids demonstrate object permanence agreement to this study. So let's say you had a practice that didn't have a mouse in it, right? So you had a block, you had a ramp, and you had a truck, right? So you drop the trolley and it rolls down the ramp and goes to the end. So you're familiarizing with the process that the truck can go all the way to the end. Then what you do is you put the mouse behind the track and then you measure, or you drop the trolley and you want to see what the kid does. That is a possible event. So because the mouse is not actually on the track, the trolley can and should and does go to the end. But what happens when you put the mouse on the track? And then the trolley goes all the way through and goes to the end. That's impossible because according to laws of physics, objects in motion stay in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. So this mouse on the track, this toy mouse, should stop the trolley from moving, but it didn't. And sure enough, even at a few months old, infants know that that shouldn't happen. So they look longer at that novelty preference experience. The impossible event shouldn't have happened, but they look. Now, let's evaluate Piaget on his claims about sensory motor stage. So Piaget claimed that certain processes are critical to help you move from one stage to another. What I'll tell you is that data does not always support this. For example, the A not B error. I said to you, according to Piaget, sometimes depending on your age, birth to 6 months, you're just out of sight, out of mind. By about 12 months, you should make the A not B error. What is the A not B error? You search location A, but you don't search location B. You search the common location, but no other location. So according to Piaget, that demonstrates you don't have mental representation. And then by about 18 months, 24 months the latest, you have full object permanence and whatnot. Now, what we have found in research is that kids don't always make the A not B error. Kids that were in the age that would fail some of Piaget's tests pass other people's tests. So the question is why? Why is it? And the answer is that maybe your perceptual abilities are much more developed than Piaget suggested. And it could be due to the fact that in the A not B test, you had to do a perceptual experience and a motor skill. So that requires two abilities, whereas a visual task is purely perceptual you can demonstrate that earlier. Now, we also want to talk about, so shifting away from Piaget, I want to talk to you about other thoughts about cognition, such as conditioning. So, Rovi Collier did a study using a rotating mobile and tying it to the ankle of an infant, that they could get the mobile to rotate by shaking their leg. And what she found was that children can learn through classical and operant conditioning. And in the case of shaking one's leg, that's operant conditioning. The behavior was governed by its consequences. So when they shook their leg, the mobile spun, which made them more likely to shake their leg. So according to this, kids learn through conditioning. Now, we also need to pay attention to attention. Attention is that which you focus your mental energy on and how you sift through various information. In early infancy, so newborns, they fix their attention on the contours. And we talked about this in vision as well, actually, when we're talking about visual acuity. It starts by looking at the edges and then gets more refined through time. By 4 months old, infants scan more thoroughly and they show greater selective attention. That is to focus on one thing to the exclusion of another. We also talked about conditioning and habituation and disinhabituation. So habituation was decreased responsiveness to a stimulus after repeated exposure. And disinhibition was a reversal of that, increased responsiveness after a change in stimulation. And we have a whole bunch of that. Now, how do kids learn? Well, they learn with support of caregivers as well, and that requires joint attention, which is the infant plus another person to focus on the same object or event. And that requires an infant to be able to track another person's behavior or what their attention is. And what we tend to see is that joint attention emerges at roughly about 7 to 8 months, but isn't fully observed until about 1 year old. And that might explain some of the language development stuff. Now, memory. Memory is the ability to retain information through time, and it has different processes and types. So encoding is the process of getting a memory in. There are other concepts called storage and retrieval. Storage is the process of holding on to a memory. And retrieval is the process of accessing a memory at a later date. So encoding, storage, and retrieval are oftentimes put together as a process of learning memory, almost like a computer model.
Yeah.
Now, we also have to talk about the difference between implicit and explicit memory. Believe it or not, you have many different subtypes of memory. So an implicit memory is the kind of memory that you learn without conscious recollection. For example, learning how to walk. Because it is a motor skill that occurs due to rote habit or automatic, you don't recall learning when, and that's one of the many reasons why, but there are many implicit memories that just happen automatically. Whereas explicit memory requires conscious effort. So things like semantic memory, which is to remember random facts, or episodic memory, to remember different events in your life. These are more explicit memories which require more conscious effort. And explicit memory requires maturation in the hippocampus and the cerebral cortex, and this starts at 6 months. Now, I will tell you, there is something called infantile amnesia, and that is children don't usually remember things that happened to them before the age of 3. And part of the reason why there's infantile amnesia is that the way the brain develops and wires, and you have, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, programmed cell death, apoptosis, and synaptic pruning, that interferes with accessing earlier memories. So that's one of the explanations of infantile amnesia. So we talked about. Another factor related to infantile amnesia could be immaturity of the prefrontal cortex. Now, your personality, your judgment, decision-making is in your prefrontal cortex, and that's another explanation. Another way that we could test memory is through imitation studies. And when you do imitation studies, you can do immediate copies or deferred imitation. So imitation is when you copy something. Well, Meltzoff and Moore demonstrated that infants have deferred imitation abilities, which is some level of mental representation and imitation skills at about 9 months. Well, according to Piaget, that's only supposed to happen at 18 months. Now you might ask yourself, who cares? Why are we getting so caught up in the ages and when they acquired something? Well, when we develop a theory, we want to make sure that that theory is accurate. However, I will give Piaget a get out of jail free card. One of the things that a stage theorist would say is focus on the process, the stages, not the ages. And Piaget might ask you, well, maybe I didn't get the timing right based on the tools I was using, but are the concepts right? Do you sequentially go in this order? And if you can agree with that, then my theory still holds merit. And that's where we are today. We believe that it still has some merit. Now, concept formation and categorization is important. So what are categories? It's basically grouping objects, events, or characteristics based on commonalities. Whereas a concept is what the category represents. And we can see other aspects of mental representation, once again, earlier than Piaget said. Perceptual categorization happens as early as 3 months. Conceptual categorization happens by about 7 to 9 months. And you develop by the age of 2 general categories. Now I'm going to talk to you about multiple category inclusions and that challenge in pre-operational stage, but I'm going to leave that out of this lecture. Now, how do we assess differences or individual differences in cognitive abilities in infancy? Now this question, truth be told, I asked one of my mentors when we were talking about intelligence testing. And I noticed that most intelligence tests, and I say most, start at the age of 2 and later. So they really are starting after infancy. So I asked one of my professors, Dr. Jeffrey Alprin, I said, so how do you test an infant? And he smiled, and he does a lot of ADHD research, so he does do child assessment. And he said, you don't. You play with an infant. You don't test them. But as cute as that answer is, there are times when you might need to assess an infant's cognitive ability. For example, if, as we talked about in an earlier lecture, a child was exposed to drugs, they might have cognitive impairments, some head trauma, they might have cognitive impairments. So you might want to have some assessment. So here it is. Here are 3 examples of assessment scales and intelligence tests. So the Gessel test has 4 categories of functioning and motor ability, language ability, adaptive functioning, and personal and social abilities. Each of these are age-related norms. So we expect a child to perform with greater proficiency as they get older, right? So your benchmark of being considered normal is lower when you're younger than when you're older. The Bailey scales has 3 components. So it has a mental scale or a cognitive scale, a motor scale, and a behavioral profile. The Bailey is used often when assessing IQ and trying to determine whether a kid is on the autism spectrum. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, you're not supposed to diagnose autism formally until 2 or 3 years old. And I'm going to tell you, informally, you can diagnose it earlier when the symptoms are pronounced. And the Bailey could be used alongside other screening instruments. The Fagan test of infant intelligence is more of a processing test. So these are 3 examples. Now, scores on infant tests are not highly correlated with IQ scores in childhood. Your IQ becomes more stable as you get older. But in infancy, it's possible that your IQ score doesn't match at a later point in time. One exception is the Fagan test because it measures things like habituation and dishabituation, which are linked to intelligence at later points in time. All right, now language development. Language development involves a form of communication, whether it be spoken, written, or signed. And we talk about language development, and the question is, how does language development occur? Well, does it occur through reinforcement, as Skinner suggests, that you say your first word and your parents cheer? Does it occur through modeling, where they teach you word by word? Or does it occur due to some natural biological process that's at play? Well, that debate of nature versus nurture in language development, we're going to talk about. But I also want to talk to you about examples of when there were severe deprivation or isolation. And I'm not going to go through all of the examples on the slide, but I want to talk about Jeannie. The case of Jeannie is as follows. So Jeannie was a child who was locked in a basement by her parents until the age of 13. Her parents never spoke to her. They gave her food on a tray. They chained her to a chair and gave her a bedpan to go to the bathroom.
Right.
Well, when Jeannie was 13, she escaped the basement. And when she was found, she was purely nonverbal. She spoke with grunts rather than words.
What the hell?
Her motor development was interfered with. She walked like Frankenstein from the movie. Gross motor development was interfered with. And she did not know how to use utensils, so she ate with her hands. And she's 13 years old.
Right.
Now, for the sake of our lecture, our question is, can Jeannie acquire language? And would she master language at a later point in time?
True.
Now, I said in the first lecture that certain aspects of development, we have sensitive periods. And a sensitive period is a window of time when development is supposed to occur. And if development doesn't occur, it's going to be stunted. It's not going to be fully mastered. And sure enough, with Jeannie, psychologists work with Jeannie, special educators work with Jeannie 40 hours a week for 4 years. And she never mastered language beyond the age of a typical 2-year-old, which is 1-2 word utterances. So, if it was just modeling and reinforcement, as Skinner said, then Jeannie should have fully mastered language even at the age of 13. Now, language is cool. It's cool that no two people speak the same, even though we have the same language. What do I mean by that? There's infinite generativity. You can create an infinite, endless number of meaningful sentences using the same finite words and rules. And I'm going to ask you, why was Shakespeare Shakespeare? Well, Shakespeare took the language of his day and turned it into meaningful experiences for people, meaningful plays, right? That's what made Shakespeare Shakespeare.
Right.
Everybody else had the same language, but Shakespeare harnessed it in a very different way than everyone else. That's an example of infinite generativity. However, I will say new words are formed every year. New words are added to the dictionary every year. And in fact, Shakespeare also added several hundred words to the dictionary by words he created. So in some ways, using a finite set of words and rules, he kind of stretched it a little bit, but the principle is a good one. Now, there are 5 parts of speech. There's phonology. The root of phonology is a phoneme, or a sound. And each language has a certain number of sounds that are relevant to it. And a phoneme is the smallest amount of a sound that makes a difference in a given language. In English, we have about 40 different sounds, but each language has their own sounds.
Right.
For example, if we were to shift our focus from the English language to Spanish, in Spanish, there are sounds that are not part of the English language. For example, there is something called nye. So if you go to Spain and you're looking for the bathroom, it's going to be written B-A-N with a little tilde above it. Is that piano? No, it's baño. Well, nye is a sound that we don't have in the English language, but if we were born in Spain, we would use. Double R is a rolling R for many dialects of Spanish. So if you're driving your car, a car is carro with a rolling R. Now let's shift away from Spanish and move to French. And I'm just going to play around a little bit more with you, and then I'm going to move on in the lecture.
That's right.
But in French, a double L is a Y sound. So there's a city in France spelled Varsailles. And in fact, there was a treaty that happened after the war there. It was the Treaty of Versailles? No, Versailles. And in French, the double L is Versailles. Now, let's shift to Middle Eastern languages, and I know a couple. I know some Arabic and I know some Hebrew, but I'm going to stay with Hebrew for the time being. Right. In Hebrew, there are sounds that are not in other parts of the world, and they're called guttural sounds, so throaty sounds. So ha and are sounds that are part of Hebrew. So there is a holiday, usually that's close to Christmas time, that Jews celebrate, where they light candles. What's the name of that holiday? Many of you are saying, oh, I know, isn't it Hanukkah? It's not actually Hanukkah, it's Chanukah. Cha, right? So the CH, cha, Chanukah. So that's a sound in Hebrew that isn't in English. The word for eyeball is ayin. Now, some people say ayin where they don't do the guttural sound, but ayin is for eye. And there's a word for deer written TZVI. And you're probably thinking that Hebrew word is tizvi. No, you taz the T called zvi. So there are certain sounds that each language has. So you get the idea though. Let's move to morphology. Morphology is about shifting a word from singular to plural, from present tense to past tense. So changing the meaning of a word by a suffix, or part of the word, I should say. Then we have, I'm going out of order, pragmatics. Nope, I lied. Then we have semantics. Semantics is the meaning of a whole word. And you might have had with your friends, oh, we're arguing over semantics. What does that mean? You're arguing over the meaning of a word, right? So when we went from sounds to adding parts to a word, now we have whole words and understanding words. From words, we get sentences, and this is why I went out of order. Sentences, we're talking about syntax. Syntax is how you string words together to make sentences. And last but not least, pragmatics are the unwritten rules of language, things like sarcasm. So you could say something and mean something entirely different, such as, sure, you were in the bathroom, right? And the way you said that is sort of like you don't believe that. Or you could use words that mean the opposite. So you might call someone who's short, hey, big guy, but you're trying to be playful for the opposite. And that's pragmatics. All right. Gestures are also part of it, nonverbal communication. So now let's talk about it. So language develops in infancy throughout the world across a similar path and sequence. Regardless of the language, you have to deal with phonetics, morphology, semantics, syntax, and pragmatics. So we typically start with sounds though. And sounds turn into like jargon, expressive jargon, where you're babbling and cooing, babbling. Actually, cooing is pure vowel sounds, babbling is a vowel with a consonant, and then eventually you say your first word. It happens in a sequence. Now, we talked about cooing and babbling already, but you could also use gestures. So pointing is a nonverbal gesture to communicate, I want that, right? Waving bye-bye. Before you can say goodbye, you can wave your hand and gesture, and that's a nonverbal communication strategy that you acquire at about 8 to 12 months. Typically, you say your first word at 12 months to about 18 months. And if your child is not speaking at 18 months, I strongly encourage you to do a whole host of testing. And in fact, the American Academy of Pediatrics suggests you should test a child for autism at 18 months and 2 years. So why 18 months? The answer is that you're supposed to have acquired language in that normal range of 12 or 13 to 18 months. All right. Now, understanding language comprehension, you understand 50 words by about 13 months. By 18 months, you can say or speak 50 words. So you'll notice that speech and language comprehension develops quicker than speech and language production. So, and on average, people typically say their first word between 10 to 15 months with the expectation of about 12 months. Now, we do have a vocabulary spurt, a word explosion, whatever you want to say, and that also happens at around 13, 14 months through early childhood, massive rapid acquisition of words. But you say your first words in this span of time. Now, you have your vocabulary spurt. One of the midpoints is about 18 months. So, but just because you learned a word doesn't mean you use the word properly. So you can engage in what's called an overextension in language or an underextension in language. An overextension in language is to apply a word that goes beyond the meaning of a word. So if you were to call every four-legged animal a dog, that would be an overextension, right? Because there are four-legged animals that are not dogs, or cats, or camels, or so many. An underextension is when you use the word too narrowly. And if anyone has done babysitting, you might have come across this with an underextension where a child asks you for a blanket. So you just look around the house and grab the first blanket you can see. And the child says, no, that's not a blanket. And you're looking at the kid and you're looking at the blanket and you're like, pretty sure this is a blanket, kiddo. But the kid's insistent, no, that's not a blanket. What are they really saying? Only their favorite blanket is a blanket. So they're using the word too narrowly. That's an underextension. Now, telegraphic speech, which is where you use short sentences, 2 or more words, starts to happen at 18 to 24 months. And here are some of the language milestones that we go through. Now, what are some factors that impact language development? Well, evolution of the nervous system and vocal apparatus play factors that impact language development. Well, evolution of the nervous system